At that point, Canada's defense minister came up to us and said, I've had it. I want to do an event like this in Canada and bring Americans and Europeans to Canada to have this conversation about the transatlantic relationship. So I think you'll find that you start one thing and it leads to something else. Now, that brings me to the third chapter, which is what are the lessons that I've taken from the growth I've seen at GMF. I've been at GMF for 7 of the past 9 years. And there are 2 big lessons. One has to do with leadership, and the other has to do with the type of growth that you experience. On the leadership point, people matter. Irene is really important in this in terms of her vision for the U.S.-Japan Council and then how she shares that vision, both with the membership and with the board, because you have to bring people along with you. And just for one example, in the GMF case, our identity was as a grant maker. We were used to giving money to other people. And by growing, we needed to also look for partners who were bringing resources to the table. That was a huge mental shift for my colleagues. And I think Craig Kennedy's leadership and having the board support this was a really important part of that. And I think if you believe in what you're doing, in this case, building a stronger U.S.-Japan relationship, in our case, strengthening the transatlantic relationship, it's fun to try to find partners to do that with you. But for us, it was a very important mindset shift. So there's a leadership component here that is critical. The second piece, which is the type of growth you experience. At some level, the growth I've seen at GMF has been a combination of strategic growth, that's about leadership. It's someone having a vision of where you want to go, and marrying that with good opportunities. You need to be opportunistic in that growth. So when Canada's defense minister comes and says, I'd like to do something like this in Canada, you say, wow, what a great opportunity. You know, we do this conference in Brussels, we don't have something in North America, and wouldn't it be interesting to do it in Canada? But it needs to fit into your strategy of what you're trying to do as an organization. And for us, the strategy that has informed our growth over the past decade has been the following one, which is the transatlantic relationship changed fundamentally with the end of the Cold War. For the Cold War history, the focus of this transatlantic relationship was Europe. It was about the defense of Europe from a common enemy, the Soviet Union. Cold War's over, Soviet Union is gone. What is the big challenge for the transatlantic relationship today? Our belief is that the challenge is how the United States, Europe, and Canada engage countries beyond Europe. So one of the real areas you've seen GMF grow has been its engagement with Asia. Because really the challenge for Americans and Europeans is how do we engage these parts of the world beyond Europe that are so important for our common future? It's interesting because when I was reading the USJC website, I saw that in your mission statement there's this real focus on strong U.S.-Japan relations, but your vision is very much grounded in a view of a vibrant Asia-Pacific region. So I think you have both of these roles too, very much in the way GMF does, but wanting to think about that U.S.-Japan relationship in this broader regional context. Now, as an example of this growth, you know, the key is how do you make it sustainable? You can have a great idea for a new project, but you want to think, how does this fit in with what we're already doing? Are there synergies across these different projects that will help sustain each individual project, A, and B, is there a secure funding base for doing this? Because you probably don't want to do it as a one-off event. You want to think about how you sustain it over time. And when I look at how GMF has grown in terms of its Asia programming, these 4 pillars I set out of grant making, networking, research, and convening, we use all of those instruments for what we're trying to do in terms of our programming on Asia. If I think about research, we hired new fellows who have an expertise on Japan, on China who can help us inform what we're doing in the region. We thought about existing products like Transatlantic Trends, this public opinion survey, and said, gosh, why don't we add some questions about attitudes toward countries in Asia to try to get a better understanding of American and European differences in their views of Asia, which are there and are profound. Okay, that's the research pillar. How do we use our convening pillar? Well, let's think about our signature conferences, Brussels Forum, Halifax International Security Forum, and include Asians in that, both as speakers but also as participants, to broaden our network in that region. On the convening side, we also have done very specific conferences. We did something last fall called What Does Japan Think? And we took an impressive group of Americans and Europeans to Japan for a week to have a series of conversations. It was fascinating. I mean, one of the things one of the European participants was telling me about is he was struck at how uninterested the Japanese were in the Europeans in the group. They really were focused on the Americans. And this fellow, prominent British journalist, asked his Japanese interlocutor at one point, you know, what is your interest in Europe? And he said, well, we're fascinated by Europe because we see Europe as a model for decline. And we're interested in how you're managing that. And it was a true answer, and it sparked a fabulous conversation. We could talk more about that, but you know, then there's also the networking pillar, which is where, you know, in our fellowship programs, we're trying to create a network of people who, through a shared experience in the US or in Europe, they may not have had a strong interest in the other before, but this experience has opened their eyes in a different way to the transatlantic relationship. Many of our smaller convening events we're also using to try to create a network. So the people we engaged in that What Does Japan Think study tour, we continue to engage. My boss, Craig Kennedy, was in Tokyo last week talking about more ways in which we can work with Japan. We do something called the Stockholm China Forum, really interesting example of both strategic and opportunistic growth. We had this vision of wanting to engage Americans and Europeans together on Asia. I was having a conversation with the Swedish political counselor, the last Swedish political counselor at the embassy here. We were actually talking about the China arms embargo, which is something that Americans, it didn't matter what your party was, did not want the EU to lift its arms embargo on China. We felt it would send the wrong message. And Sweden is an interesting case on this because Sweden didn't think it would ever sell arms to China. They have very strict national arms exports controls, but they care deeply about human rights. So they understood why it might be the wrong message to send to China at the time to lift the arms embargo for that reason. And I said, gosh, it'd be so interesting to get Americans, Europeans, and Asians together to talk about this. And he said, let's do it. So we have a Stockholm China Forum. And I thought, it's not a conversation you would want to have in Berlin or Paris because those countries have such a deep economic relationship with China that that will color the way they view the relationship. So we were getting closer to a programming area we thought was rich, and we now had a partner to do that. Final pillar is the grant-making pillar. What we've done is we've taken some of our grant-making funds and we've put them in a pot called strategic grant making, where we're trying to give smaller grants to researchers looking at this nexus of US, Europe, Asia, and encouraging them to do work on that set of issues. So what we've been doing in the way we've grown is tried to think about how do we use our instruments to have sustainable growth in an area that we've just defined as strategically important for GMF. So I will stop with that. That was the story I wanted to tell you in the 3 chapters, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you so much.